We've just figured out how to go live, and we're waiting for people to show up for the event. We're excited to be here. Want to welcome everyone, and we'd love it if you post in the comment section. Just let us know where you're tuning in from. We want to see how many people in BC on the West Coast, how many towns we're hitting. That's exciting to see. I think everybody is excited to be gardening this year. Definitely more and more interest we're seeing. So I want to welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Reeves. I'm the marketing manager with New Society Publishers. And for those of you who may not be familiar with New Society, we're located on Gabriola Island, which is one of the Gulf Islands here in British Columbia. We're proud to be celebrating our 40th year of publishing this year, so that's really exciting for us, and we're really proud of that. We specialize in books that offer positive solutions for troubled times, so times like now that we're all experiencing together. We publish in categories of like progressive leadership, social responsibility, new economy, sustainable building, homesteading, health and wellness, and of course, food and gardening, and much, much more. We care about how we publish as well as what we publish. We like to say our books are so green you could eat them, although you probably don't want to try that. And that's because we publish on 100% recycled paper. We're a carbon neutral company. We're a certified B Corporation, and our employees are shareholders in the company. So you can find out more about our books and how we do business at newsociety.com. So I'm really excited to be able to introduce our speaker today. I think if this shared experience of the pandemic has brought to light for many of us the importance of food security. And I think we can all say we're seeing a surge of people wanting to grow their own food. And it's very exciting, but sometimes it isn't as easy as we think it's going to be. So I think we all start out with good intentions, and you can have, for me, I've gardened for many years, and every year something new and exciting shows up in the garden that I don't know how to handle or aren't sure what it is. So enter Linda Gilkeson. So Linda has 40 years of gardening experience on the West Coast. She's a regular instructor in master gardening programs and gives courses and workshops on organic gardening and pest management for a variety of groups and organizations. Linda has her best-selling book right here is Backyard Bounty, the complete guide to year-round organic gardening in the Pacific Northwest, now in its second edition, and it's been expanded to include information on growing food in a changing climate. It covers everything you know how to grow a successful garden on the West Coast. And one of my favorite features is a monthly gardening schedule for year-round planting. So you can go to lindagilkeson.ca to find out more about Linda and some of the other books that she has written, which can also be ordered there. And New Society Publishers is offering a 20% discount on our website when you order Backyard Bounty. You just enter the code BOUNTY at the checkout and you get a 20% discount, and that's valid until June 5th. So before we hand it over to Linda, I'd like to invite people. Linda's going to give her presentation, and then she'll invite people to post your questions. So if you can post those in the comment section, and Linda will answer as many as she can during the allotted time. So Linda, over to you.
Well, hi. I can't imagine how many people are out there, but this is pretty exciting. I'm going to just put up a PowerPoint slideshow at the moment. I thought what I would do is prepare a few slides. Sorry, Scotch broom is out on Salt Spring Island, so I'm feeling the pollen. I thought what I would do is, rather than just start off with questions, I would talk about just 4 areas where I find that there are the most consistent problems, especially when people are new gardeners. Just some tips. And so there'll be a short section here. The first thing that I want to talk about is the climate here, because I know that some of you, at least, will have been gardening elsewhere, probably elsewhere in Canada, or maybe elsewhere even on the continent. And this region is unique. And one of the reasons that I have, over the last 30 or 40 years, stuck to writing books for this region is there wasn't very much. And that was really explicitly correct for us, whether it was pests that we had and other people didn't, or vice versa, climate things for our gardens. You would pick up a book for North America. I used to write for Rodale years ago, and I'd have to write for all of North America. So this unique region really, I felt, was a bit short on local information. So what we have here, unlike a lot of places, is a very, very long, cool spring. You could call February spring, and you could call this week spring. So we have months of spring. We do have what you would consider a moderate temperature summer. We do get heat waves, and we are getting increasingly more heat waves as the climate has changed. But consistently, we do not have a very warm summer. We have very mild winters. Of course, there are short cold snaps, and occasionally they're not short. But generally, this is a milder winter, and it's certainly for the latitude that we are in, a very mild winter. Nowhere else in Canada could possibly have a winter this warm. We have on the coast mountains and seashores and inlets and lakes and every kind of geography. So there's a lot of variation in microclimates in this coastal region. So whereas in the middle of Saskatchewan, you might get away with the temperatures at the local airport telling you when your last frost-free date is, whereas here that means nothing, because you just have to go a kilometer down the road and the garden can have frost that you won't see at all. It's very variable. And there's one other little aspect here, which will probably come up later if we get into questions about how come my spinach is bolting and things like that. We're so far north here that these extremely long days at this time of year make some plants do things they don't do farther south. They stimulate flowering. But the result for us is that we have this extremely long growing season for certain vegetables that are the ones that like this kind of weather. It isn't always easy to get crops with the highest heat requirements to do well here. And a lot of people on the coast will put in greenhouses. But we can grow some less hardy fruit like figs, and people have lemon trees and things that couldn't possibly be grown at this latitude elsewhere in the country. And then we have the fact that we can just simply harvest hardy vegetables all winter quite reliably in our garden. And of course, I cannot resist the desire to brag. This was a picture I just took a couple weeks ago in my garden. What I'm showing you here is zucchini and lettuce that was sown this spring, but Swiss chard, purple sprouting broccoli, cauliflower, scallions, these were all in the garden all winter. So this is, to me, a picture that embodies what we can do with our gardens. We can have both ends of the season meet so that we're picking everything at this time of year. So I find most of the problems that people have arise from making sure they get enough soil nutrients. And then the next one is timing planting, whether it's the spring or particularly in order to have crops in the winter. We don't realize how early those need to be sown. And I have a specific issue that comes up so commonly, I can't believe it, and it's getting squash pollinated. And then I have a couple common pests and diseases for this time of year, and that's all I'm going to talk about before I take questions. So just to go to review, if you're a gardener that's used to all kinds of other plants, but this might be the first time you've grown vegetables, what you need to know is that they're little pigs. They need a huge amount of sunshine. They need lots of available nutrients. They need water. They are not like growing any of our landscape material or even flowers, and they're certainly not at all like native plants. These plants have been selected to grow very fast using a lot of nutrients and resources. And we also need slightly acidic soil for vegetables, and that's not our natural soil condition on the coast. Usually most of our soils are rather acidic. So we need these things to have vegetables do well. The highest amount, the nutrient needed in the highest amount is nitrogen. And for an organic garden, this is the hardest to get a good supply of nitrogen available all season long in the first couple of years. The nitrogen is coming from the activity of the soil microorganisms, breaking down compost and utilizing, if you've put in some organic fertilizers, it's being made available to the plants. Over the years, as you add compost and build up this nutrient bank, then nitrogen shortage isn't a problem anymore. But the picture I show here is soil that was delivered to a community garden in Vancouver. It was good garden soil. That was supposed to be good enough for gardens. And it probably was fine for a lawn. But this is what's happened to the vegetables. They've eventually given up because they didn't have enough nutrients and they've gone to seed. So if you have plants that are pale yellow when they should be dark green, or really telltale, the newest leaves are green, but the older leaves are pale yellow, that is a very clear sign of nitrogen deficiency. And that is the hardest nutrient to come up with reliably. And you will need to add a complete organic fertilizer and compost to your garden to be able to get that sufficient food going. Of course, plants need potassium. They need a lot of calcium and magnesium and phosphorus. And most soils actually have enough phosphorus. It just needs to be available to the plants. So, and if you're growing an organic garden, micronutrients, do not worry about those. Do not try and supplement or add micronutrients because those can be toxic in large amounts. I'm sure that if you're using any kind of compost and possibly leaf mulch, and all these sources have plenty of micronutrients in them. So our real job is to get enough nitrogen into the new organic garden, the new years of a garden. Now our soils, as I mentioned earlier, usually need lime. It's actually a very good idea to get a soils test just for pH, and that is a measure of how acidic your soil is. And we have a very, very economical remedy, which is ground up limestone rock. And it does two things in our soil. It raises the pH, meaning it makes the soil less acidic, but it also adds calcium. So we don't have to have another calcium source because we're doing two things here. The benefit here is that many of these nutrients that we're going to put into the soil via compost and complete fertilizers are more available at the correct pH than if the soil is very acidic. And that's because there is a better population of soil microorganisms growing in soil that is slightly acidic rather than very acidic. Also, soils have heavy metals naturally in them, and some of those we don't want them to be too available. And as you make the soil less acidic, it makes these heavy metals less available to the plants, which is actually desirable for vegetables. Moving on to the issue of timing of planting, one thing that we can do here that nobody else in Canada gets themselves into trouble with is we can start out there in the garden awfully early in the year. And the reason we get ourselves into trouble with this is that many of the vegetables that we grow are biennial plants, meaning that they take 2 seasons to flower. So if you think about lettuce, if you put lettuce in the garden now and just leave it and don't pick it, you'll get flowers this year. That's an annual plant. But if you put carrots or leeks or kale, many of you have kale blooming right now, you put that in the garden this spring, you get your carrot crop or your kale leaves or whatever. If you leave those plants in the garden all winter, the cold chill of winter tells the plant that it's on its second year, and that's why they make flowers this year. And that's all normal, and this is what we want to have happen. But it too often happens, it only happens to the really hardworking gardeners that have tried to get their crops in the ground too early. If you start your biennials too early, and they grow a bit, the weather's nice for a while, and then we get a cold week or two, that fakes them into thinking they've had winter. And then suddenly in the middle of the summertime on their first year, we get leeks with flowers and onions with flowers and chard. And all that hard work all we've done is get the plants set up for producing seed in the growing season that we don't want them to. So really it's the gardeners that seed things the latest and are the laziest, or just were away on a trip or something and came back and put their gardens in late. They're the ones that have the successful gardens. People that put in, if you're looking at how big a plant needs to be to switch its pathway and produce flowers, it doesn't have to be very big. If you put in onion sets and they're a nickel size, they might, if it gets cool for a few weeks, which this spring it certainly did, they might just go to flower in July. And, you know, if you've started your leeks really early and grown them very carefully and they're as big as a pencil when you put them out, they're very much at risk for this cold chill effect. And the same with cabbage seedlings and things with more than 5 leaves. So here's the remedy is have a lot of overwintered crops, and then you have no desire to go out there and plant things early. This cauliflower that I just picked a couple weeks ago was sown at the end of June last year. Leaf beet, it's like a very fine stemmed chard. That was sown in July last year. And spinach, I sow that in August, and then it doesn't go to seed on me, and I have it all winter, and I just pulled it out actually. It's pretty much done. But I don't have to do anything with those plants. I didn't have to rush them into the ground early because they were already there. Which brings me to the issue of planting your winter crops at the right time. This is a little fragment of a planting chart that's on my homepage, and you can just download that and print it out. It shows you the planting windows for common crops that we would grow for winter. The planting dates are critical here in that you can't really plant later than this and be sure that you can get your full-sized crops before winter. Nothing is going to grow in the winter, or if it grows, it's very, very slow. So they have to have enough growing time to be a head of cabbage or a full-size leek or a nice-sized carrot. And that needs to happen by the end of October. So what these planting windows are is giving you the dates that if you seed your carrots, for example, July 1st is carrot day at my house. And many of you that have been on my mailing list for a long time know that. You will get that email every year at the end of June saying carrot day is about to arrive. Because if I seed my carrots that I want to eat next winter on July 1st, I know that I will have beautiful full-size carrots by then. Now, of course, I've sowed carrots last month in the garden. That's for eating in the summertime. But what's on this list is the crops in order to have them developed in time for us to have them in the garden for the winter. Our goal here is to have our garden a living refrigerator, completely stuffed with full-sized crops in late October. So here we have heads of cabbage and full-size leeks, and that's broccoli and cauliflower, and there's beets and carrots and greens. This is not empty, this is garlic, those are leeks. And even under this pole bean pole, underneath it, I have sown corn salad and hardy lettuce underneath. So when I take the pole beans away, that garden is full. So your garden, it's very much a contrast. Remember, if you've gardened elsewhere, in October, you're putting the garden to bed, by which people mean it's empty, they're mulching or whatever. But our gardens are now primed to be a refrigerator for the winter so that we can walk out there in the non-growing season and just keep harvesting. So yeah, sometimes you're walking out in snow, but underneath that snow, we have leeks and carrots and Brussels sprouts and all sorts of things. Which brings me to one little trick that is often a problem, is that a lot of these crops, you saw that chart, July and August are prime seeding season for a lot of these winter crops. Well, starting seeds in the summer, the soil is often too warm for things to germinate. You may not have realized that at certain temperatures, things like lettuce and carrots, they won't germinate no matter how nicely moist you keep the soil. They just won't germinate. So we need to have another skill set for starting seeds. In the spring, we want to get the seed beds warm and dry and keep the seedlings warm. In the summer, we want to cool them. So plant your seeds a little bit deeper and then shade the seed bed with something that will, that's not going to, that's actually going to cool it. I like old burlap because I've got it around, but old beach towels work great, old sheets, newspapers work fine too. And then just keep checking. This also keeps the seed bed evenly moist, which is the other challenge in the summertime. It just is very hard to keep it moist. You might have to sprinkle it 3 times a day. If you soak the seed bed and then cover it like this, you might only water every 3 days. And then if it's still hot when those seeds come up, be sure to shade them. It could be anything. You can turn over pots or seed flats, or you could have shade cloth. You can see how happy these seedlings are underneath. the shade cloth. You can make a lattice, wooden lattice work, anything like that. Temporary shading can be invented, and the plants will really appreciate it. All seedlings should be shaded. And then later, as your cabbage family and lettuce and things get bigger, although they wouldn't necessarily need to be shaded, they do appreciate it and they grow better when it's only in a heat wave. So I now, because I do have the shade cloth, I just throw it over cabbages and broccoli and things if it gets really hot. But seedlings are at risk of frying, but the little roots are too close to the surface. So at least protect your seedlings. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, one common problem, I'm kind of skipping around to problems here, is the no squash problem. People know that growing zucchini is supposed to be as easy as falling off a log. You should have too much zucchini. And so it's really funny at gardening workshops, people will come up to me afterwards and confess to zucchini failure because they don't want to say it in class or in the workshop because they think they're the only person that can't get zucchini to grow. And in fact, this is very common in small gardens and especially in urban areas because when there isn't enough squash around to be blooming at the same time to attract pollinators, or if there's not very many pollinators, and we are definitely noticing much fewer pollinators, a lot of concern about that. So the flowers did not get pollinated. But the tricky thing here is that you can have the flowers on the plants normally, and then the flowers fall off, and then the little squash will grow for a while. And so you think it did get fertilized because it grew, and then it shrivels up. Sometimes it rots, sometimes it just falls off or turns yellow. And in fact, it was not fertilized, and you're going to have to do that. So especially in this time of year and at the end of the season, you probably are just best off assuming that you should hand pollinate your squash family. And this is very easy. You look for a male flower and a female flower. The female flower always has a little miniature version of whatever the squash is behind the flower. So this is a zucchini here. The male flower just has a straight stem. It may be shorter or longer depending on the variety, but it never has the little baby fruit behind it. You just pick that male flower off and fold the petals back and tap the pollen in the center here of the female flower, and you're done. Now you can see this is there's a female flower that hasn't opened yet, and here's one that's opened and shriveled, and here's one that's in prime condition. The flowers open in the morning, and in the summer they only last one day. So on your way out of the house in the morning, even if you're just on your way to work early, you can do the pollination before you leave. Pick a male flower and move the pollen to the middle of the female flower. Sometimes you'll see all one sex of a flower at one time. That's just the odds. Some varieties produce males first, some produce females first. But eventually you will see both male and female flowers. And that is a way to absolutely ensure you have squash. Now there's one little interesting detail here. It's a little complicated, but it is very helpful if you know what species group your squash is in. If you go to West Coast Seeds and look at your squash descriptions there, it'll say right in the description, right up after the name, it'll say whether it is a C. pepo, or it'll say it's a maxima, or it'll say it's a moschata. Now, most of our summer squash are this species. Now, the good thing about that, and the reason it's useful to know, is that if you have a zucchini and a patty pan and a crookneck and a delicata and an acorn, I can use the same male flower to pollinate all of those female flowers on all of those squash. And one male flower can pollinate many female flowers. So if I go out in the garden one morning and there's one zucchini male flower and several female flowers on other things, I can still pollinate them all successfully. So as long as you know which ones are which, a lot of the winter squash are a different group, and the butternuts all have to be, you have to stick to butternuts to do the butternuts. If you're in doubt and you can just use a male flower from the same plant, that's fine, and that always works. But this is just this is a little tip to know. I used to write on a Post-it note and stick it on the fridge which ones could do which until I'd memorized them. And then I knew how I could pollinate. Okay, we have just a couple pests at this time of year, and the slugs have been quite stunning. I'm sure a lot of people have noticed quite the slug population. It's been prolonged moist weather, which is exactly what they like. So of course the search and destroy method, I mean, is under boards and under anything. You know, anything you can do to protect the natural enemies. Unfortunately, we're missing a lot of snakes. Cats eat snakes, so in suburban areas that seems to be snakes are lacking because of that. But these ground beetles, if you go out in your garden at night, you may see quite a lot of activity. They eat slug eggs and small slugs and root maggots and things like that. So these are your buddies, these big black beetles. There's purplish looking ones, purplish green ones. There's a number of different species. Some other tips is when you're watering seedlings, just do it very early in the day and so that the soil surface can dry out by evening. If you've seen the iron or ferric phosphate baits, it might say iron, it might say ferric phosphate on the container or on the bag. These are safe. These are not like the old metaldehyde baits. They are not a danger to wildlife or pets. So, and I think that's all you can buy now. I mean, I don't think you can get the metaldehyde baits anymore, but sometimes people still have that stored in their basement. So do not use that stuff. The iron, the baits that you can buy now are safe. They look like a grain of pasta. That's actually, they are a grain of pasta with iron in it. And the slugs are attracted to eat the little granule. And then when they eat the iron, the heavy metal in their, something about their physiology, it prevents them from making slime. And this is sort of gross, I'm sorry, I forgot, it's right after dinner, but that is a rather large European black slug that is dried up because of eating the bait. So the way you use this bait correctly is just use very small amounts of it over a wide area because it is not a poison and it doesn't have a toxic action. So, and it attracts slugs. So if you have a little plant coming up and you put a circle of that bait right around that plant, the slugs come in and eat the pasta course and then they eat the vegetable course. They have plenty of time to eat your vegetables before they crawl away and eventually die. So use just small amounts over a bed, ideally on an empty bed first, or you can plant your seeds and then put the slug bait out before your seedlings come up. And those are two quite useful ways to use the slug bait. Now, most people on the coast in most regions have a carrot rust fly attacks carrots if they're left unprotected all summer. The carrots you plant very early in the spring often don't have that much damage. It depends where you are. Around Victoria, when I used to live around Victoria, I couldn't get a carrot seed into the ground in the spring before it was attacked. There was a lot of carrot rust fly in the spring. But where I live on Salt Spring now, I don't really worry about this till midsummer. There are 2 or 3 generations a year though. And so by August and September, there are a lot of these flies and they lay their eggs right at the top of the carrot where the foliage and the soil and the top of the carrot meet. And then the little maggot that hatches out burrows down through the carrot and does this kind of damage. If you're growing carrots for winter and you don't have very much root maggot in, you might think it was okay, but the carrots you start digging up halfway through the winter, the little worms have been in there all winter chewing away and the carrots can be a real mess. So I always cover my carrots. I seed in July. You can cover them with insect nettings, which are kind of expensive, but very durable or not disposable and they don't rip. Or you can, if you've got some reme, some floating row cover around, that certainly works fine too. But you need to leave the covers in place. What we're doing is preventing the flies from coming in and laying eggs on the carrots. There is a very similar insect that attacks all of the cabbage family. Same thing, 2 or 3 generations a year. It's a fly that comes in and lays its eggs right there at the base of the plant. And then the maggots climb down, and this is what they would do to a radish. This is actually one of the little maggots that was out of the roots of the Chinese cabbage here. So what you get from above the soil, the symptom is that the plants just wilt. They seem to have enough water. And it's a very sporadic attack. One cabbage will look just fine. One will look very sad. One will die and another one will look sad. So that's very characteristic of cabbage root maggot. with small cabbage family, which is things like radishes and Chinese cabbage, again, we can cover them with insect netting. But the really big crops, this is a cauliflower and broccoli bed. It's not feasible and really not desirable to do that, but we can put a little barrier in place here on the soil. And it's just like the carrots. We just leave the barrier in place for the entire season. And when the end of October, when the insects are hibernating, we can take the barriers away if we want to. I did do a little diagram of this because I get questions about this every time I mention this little barrier. So I drew you a diagram. It's about, I don't know, 15 centimeters or so. Doesn't have to be any bigger than that, certainly. And it's a square of any kind of flexible, soft, waterproof material. Thin foam sheets that computers come packed in, waterproof paper like freezer paper. I've lately been just cutting apart the bags that compost, like fish compost or something, or chicken feed bags, or any of those kinds of things work beautifully. So you cut your square and you cut a slit down the middle, and I make a little X here so that when I slip this thing along the stem, it fits really tightly to the stem. That's all you're trying to do, is physically prevent the fly from laying her eggs. And I just leave it in place. I put some pebbles on because the wind will blow that. I'll just mulch right over the top and leave it for the entire season. And one last thing on powdery mildews, because everybody gets this. This isn't one disease. It is many different fungi, but they're all in a group called powdery mildews. And the main characteristic of this group of fungi is that they reproduce in humid weather, but not wet weather. So for us, it's the end of the summer. Late in the summer, we start seeing all kinds of things with this powdery white layer on. Now, these will be all different species of fungi. This one is a rare one that some years attacks tomatoes, but we have it on peas, and this is Chinese cabbage here, or sorry, mustard. This is mustard greens. You might even see it on chard. Depends entirely what happens, what spores fly into your neighborhood. The one characteristic they all have is that if these leaves are wet, they can't germinate. The spores can't germinate. And that's why in the fall, when the rains start, the powdery mildew just melts away. So we are best advised to prevent it. There are powdery mildew resistant squashes, cucumbers, and peas. Here is the arrow is pointing to a leaf of a zucchini that is resistant to powdery mildew that is growing in a patch of other squash that have quite a bit of infection. The presence of water stops the spores from germinating, so you can always wash the leaves down if you've got the water, and that slows infection considerably. And then the other thing is to keep your plants growing really vigorously over the summer. At the end of the season, we tend to kind of let the squash go, but keeping water and nutrients, you may want to feed them a little bit of fish fertilizer in water. You can see in this picture how the younger leaves are really quite resistant. The mildew fungi attack the older leaves. So that's the other thing you can do. So between resistant varieties and just keeping things growing vigorously, we can make the best of it. Don't worry about trying to control it all. Don't try and pull all these leaves off. That's not going to work. The squash can use those leaves. And most of the time you will have a perfectly adequate crop. So we've arrived at questions. Sarah, what are we getting for questions?
Okay, we have quite a few here, and I'm just scrolling through them. And I think some of the first ones to come up are sort of about things that go into the garden early, like our lettuce and spinach. So somebody was questioning, it's Jennifer, was wondering why her spinach has already bolted, as well as her arugula and cilantro. She said they did come from locally purchased organic starts. So what can she do? Why have they bolted, and what can she do in the future to avoid this happening?
Well, Barbara, Jennifer, you're living at the northern latitude. Remember I mentioned right at the beginning our long days? Spinach cannot resist that. No, so I seed spinach about the second week of August, and the days are substantially shorter then than they are now. and they're getting shorter quickly. And the plants do not go to seed, even if it's hot in August. And I can eat spinach off of those plants all fall. And in the spring, they have this whole new lease on life, and this huge crop appears again. And then they start going to seed at this time of year. If you seed spinach in the spring, it also goes to seed at this time of year. If you seed spinach in another 2 weeks, I swear it'll come up going to seed, because the day lengths are too long, and that's the signal. So you can't fight the day lengths with spinach. That's the way it's going to react. Some varieties are a little worse than others, but this is the price of living this far north. The cilantro and arugula, they're annuals, and they grow very, very quickly and go to seed. That is what they do. And probably they've just grown long enough now, and that causes them to go to seed. Again, they can also be responding to these long day lengths. In the case of arugula and the cilantro, the best approach is just sow a little bit of seed every 2 weeks, so that you always have it coming along fresh, and it'll always be the size that you want it to be for harvest. But you can't stop it by cutting the flowers off, for example. It's just going to do that. So you didn't do anything wrong at all, except to live at this latitude.
Now you've mentioned.
Sorry.
Oh, so you mentioned before that with spinach, it really likes the cool climates. So is that one that you would suggest would do better in your winter garden rather than your spring garden?
Well, I end up having it in the spring garden because I plant it for the winter garden. So I get the same plants have survived through the garden and produce spinach from August till just now. But if I start them in the spring, they only can go till just now. That's just right. You know, so yes, of course, the earlier you start spinach, the better. You'll get a little more production, but you could also go clear to the end of the season and start thinking of it as a late in summer thing to plant. And then you'll for sure have it for the spring. And they grow big leaves. They're amazing when they come through the winter, and they just take off again in the spring. They're quite productive. So if you grow it in the spring, just don't be surprised that it goes to seed right now, because it has to.
Yeah, mine's definitely starting to do that. And so I'm having spinach with every meal.
Well, if you seed it in June or July, it comes up about an inch, and then there's seeds already. There's flowers. It just cannot resist this urge to because of the long days.
Well, and speaking about sort of getting the longer, warmer days, people are asking about mulching and asking if you recommend using hay as a heat shielding mulch.
Hay is, if that's what you've got, use it. It's often brings the risk of a lot of weed seeds, agricultural weed seeds. It's in and of itself, and straw can too, actually. Straw would have less, but straw can have crop seeds. My favorite mulch is leaves. And so this fall, like this summer, get through whatever you've got, use anything you can get. So if that's all you can get, you can certainly use it. But this fall, try and get leaves, maple leaves, any kind of leaves, and store them till next year. I rake up the leaves when they're driest and store those in bins or bags under the overhang of my garage so that they stay dry. If you keep leaves dry for the winter, they don't break down. If they're wet in a compost pile or on the ground, then they break down over the winter. So I'm a real leaf miser. I store leaves for mulch. I mulch the garden, and then I store a whole bunch that I'm going to actually take out in another few weeks and start opening up those bins and use that as mulch. It's free, really good nutrients there. And if you can do that, that's really the best. But of course, I use everything, crop waste, yard waste, anything at all as mulch if I need it.
So does that include, so I saw somewhere that you can, mow your lawn and put your glass clippings. I put it on my potatoes, and then I got scared that I was about to grow a bunch of grass in my potatoes by doing that. But is that okay to put your fresh grass clippings as a mulch as well?
You can. It just doesn't last very long, because grass clippings are just water and nitrogen. I mean, they're really lovely nutritionally for the garden. but they also really benefit the lawn. So most people, I think nowadays, you cut the lawn and leave the clippings on the lawn. But if you have lawn clippings, you can certainly use it as a mulch. I like it as, I do steal some clippings from my little tiny strip of lawn in the spring just to use it on seedlings, because it's so soft and flexible that I can easily get it in around quite small plants if we have hot weather. But you will find that it doesn't last very long. Once you sprinkle it on the soil, it goes very quickly.
Okay.
It isn't like straw or leaves that will give you a season's worth of mulching value, as it were. It just feeds the soil. It's very good stuff for the soil.
Okay, good. So we have a question from Janice about growing radishes without wormholes. So I guess that would maybe apply to other root crops and avoiding.
Well, that is, in fact, exactly why I put this up here. This is probably what you're worrying about. Your radishes are getting this kind of wormholes, I wonder, or if it's wire worms, I wonder. It's probably the root maggot. And the best thing is to just cover the radishes with some kind of barrier. And that can be just floating row cover, the remay, or it can be insect netting. The insect nettings brand names are Protect Net, EnviroMesh, Bug Out. There's more of it available now. And this is designed to let in, it's more than 90% of the sunlight gets in and rain gets in, irrigation water gets in, but insects can't. And it's very tough stuff. I've had EnviroMesh, I've had the same material for 10 years and you can't rip it. So it's very sturdy. So either that or the floating row covers work just fine on vegetables because they're soft and they won't rip the row cover material.
Great. So it seems like we have a few people with issues with pests. We have Jamie asking that if he had a cabbage crop that was attacked by root maggots, can they pull them out and plant a new crop of cabbage seedlings this month with collars, or will the current generations of maggots still be there?
Yes, the current generation of maggots will be there. You need a couple months. You need, okay. I'm going to go to my crop rotation slides. Oops, screen sharing has stopped. Oh, okay. Well, it's okay. I'm gonna make it come back. I don't know why it didn't. We're all just learning here, so I am going to scroll down here very quickly and go to crop rotation here and show this slide because this is kind of part of that same question. Now, is that slide up there, Sarah? Is this one, am I showing a crop rotation slide? Oh, I can't hear you, Sarah.
Yes, you are. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. You can see it.
This part of this is that the root maggot and carrot rust fly, if you're going to cover that crop with netting or use barriers, you need a couple months for the previous crop's insects to emerge. So yeah, he can't take a cabbage family crop out that's infested right now and put another one in, but he could in July. Because by that time, the insects will have done their life cycle and flown away. So you just need a short rotation there. You need a short period. He could grow lettuce. You could grow something else between your two crops and then put your cabbage family plants back in again. The same with carrots. So the reason I probably confused everything by bringing this crop rotation slide up, but it is important to have some space between cabbage family and carrot family plants to let the insects emerge. Now, crop rotation alone doesn't solve the problem because the insects just emerge and fly to the next garden or the next bed, but it does prevent you from accidentally trapping them in under the barriers and having them just keep on attacking your crops.
Okay, great. So we'll keep on with the pests. Josie asked about flea beetles on potatoes and how to control them.
Yeah, flea beetles on potatoes. You will also see the flea beetles. I don't think I didn't put any flea beetle slides in here, but it's very tiny little holes that you'll see on the lower leaves of the potatoes and tomatoes now. The damage has already happened, and the beetles they literally do look like fleas. They're little shiny black beetles that leap very quickly. Next year, what you'll see in your potatoes this year is the skins of the potatoes will be very rough with tracks all through them. If you peel that off, the potato is fine underneath, but the damage is in just the surface under the skin, and there's nothing you can do about that now because it's too late in the season. The flea beetles have laid their eggs and the larvae have gone into your potato roots. But next year, you could cover those potatoes with floating row cover for the first part of the season, and while the beetles are active, and then they're gone. Then you can uncover the plants for the rest of the year, and you won't have the damage. You will see this damage on tomatoes, and it's not usually an issue. We're not eating the tomato roots, and they don't do enough damage to really do anything to the plant, usually. So I wouldn't worry about seeing that on the tomatoes, but yeah, you'll just have to peel your potatoes a little bit more this year than you want to, maybe thought you needed to. But next year, when you put the potatoes in, as soon as those shoots are up, they should have a floating row cover over them for about a month.
Okay, great. And we'll do one more. I'm assuming it's a pest. Haley Nicole asks about her cauliflower and says that she discovered a green slime consisting of little balls in the base of the stems this morning. And she's wondering if you know what it could be.
I wonder if it's on the outside of the stem or inside. If it's little pellets, like dark green pellets, that's caterpillar poop. There's a caterpillar bin there. Now, if she didn't find the caterpillar, it could have been eaten by a wasp. This time of year, the yellow jackets and the big hornets are combing right through our vegetables and grabbing all the caterpillars and pulling them out. And it's actually quite common to see the caterpillar poop left behind and nobody's there because a bird got it or a yellow jacket got it. But I would say if that is a sign that somewhere there was feeding, so look through the plant a little more carefully and see if you find a little green caterpillar.
That's very cool. I never would have thought of caterpillar poop.
Yes, entomologists call it frass.
Okay.
And then they say things like, boy, the frass really hit the fan today. So.
And so, of course, we have some questions about soil and the nutrients in the soil, and people asking about nitrogen, some asking if the plants are yellow, if it's presumed a nitrogen deficiency, and if they can recover, and others if there's signs of too much. So can you address ways to increase nitrogen in the system, or ways to know if you don't have enough or too much?
Right. Well, the first thing is if your plants seem a little pale and you give them some nitrogen, they will definitely recover. So that's the good news. Plants move these nutrients inside the plant at different rates. So nitrogen is one the plant can mobilize and move around pretty rapidly. So if you have a rather sad looking little squash that's pale right now, and you give it some liquid fish fertilizer, get some liquid fish and pour it, mix it in, I think it's whatever the recipe is, a tablespoon per gallon or whatever, and you feed that to that squash plant, within 10 days, you'll see definitely greener leaves and you'll see it perking up. But for a more permanent fix, you need something like blood meal or fairly rich or manure or compost that has a reasonably good nitrogen content. The thing is, our homemade composts usually are quite low in nitrogen. Now, fish compost is something like 2% usually, and that's really quite good for an organic amendment. And so making sure that there's plenty of nitrogen source there before you plant is one thing, but if you've got yellowing plants now, you don't want to disturb the roots. So you can use the liquid fertilizer to feed right around the plant, but farther out away from the roots, because the plants won't be that big right now, you could sprinkle blood meal, or you could add put fish compost, a pretty good layer of it there, and scratch it into the soil. And you could mulch with fish compost, and those will all keep providing nitrogen. But if you're already running into a nutrient deficiency, probably plan to be using fish fertilizer most of the summer. It's very common your first year or two in an organic garden to have to be feeding liquid nitrogen for the first year. We all end up, I mean, first year in my garden here, it's the same thing. A really cheap way to make it is to put some horse manure in a bucket with some soil, with water, or use some compost. Fish compost works very well. A shovel full of that in a pail of water, and soak it overnight, no more than a day or two. And what you're doing is extracting the most soluble nutrients, and nitrogen is one. And you're extracting the nitrogen from the horse manure or the chicken manure or the fish fertilizer. And then you dilute that water till it's quite pale. You don't want to put it on too strongly. And you can use that as your liquid fertilizer. And that's more economical than buying fish fertilizer. But this may be a season that you will have to do that for part of the year. What we're trying to do here is build up enough organic matter in the soil, and it takes a few years, that the community of soil microbes has food and a big nutrient bank of food, and they're going to make the nitrogen available to your crops. So we don't want to keep our crops on life support here. We want to get this built up. I mean, it's a whole huge community of organisms, and plants actually feed these organisms. They exude, some of the sugars that plants make through photosynthesis, they leak out of their roots into the soil around them. And this was quite stunning when people discovered this, because it was like, why would they do this? But the plants are feeding this community of organisms. So once this gets really rich and there's lots of food and compost for it to operate on humus, as compost breaks down into humus, this is food for this holds this whole system, keeps this whole system working. I was going to say, well, yeah, you don't need this slide. Any kind of compost, but we're trying to get organic matter digested from organic matter that we put into the soil becomes humus, which is super digested organic matter. And that is holding the nutrients and making, where the nutrient bank is. And it can be anything you feed to the soil, but the first couple of years, you just don't have enough coming back to those plants. It's hard to overdo nitrogen with vegetables. It's possible when people are using chemical fertilizers that are quite high analysis. They may say like 20 or something on the bag. That's a super dose of nitrogen, and you don't need that. You can use the organic amendments. Even a complete organic fertilizer will be maybe 4% to 7% nitrogen, and that's plenty. But you do need to make sure that your vegetables are getting enough food, and they will recover if they're looking kind of sad right now. If you're a new gardener and you're not sure if your vegetables are looking sad, ask somebody that is a gardener what their garden looks like, or go and see other gardens. There's a huge amount of effort this year, especially going into having mentor gardeners helping new gardeners, and lots of information out there on Facebook and in gardening groups and in one-to-one interactions. So find somebody to show you what your plants should look like. Compost alone just doesn't supply enough nutrients. And this was what I mentioned earlier. Homemade compost, if it's really well made, it might have 1% nitrogen, but these commercial products are fine. That's 2% is a perfectly usable, perfectly valuable amount of nitrogen. You can also, this is blood meal being put into a bed where the soil wasn't that great, but corn is going to be planted fairly far apart, and you could do the same thing with squash. Where you're going to put the seedlings in, you could bump up the nitrogen with blood meal or alfalfa meal or fish compost. Any of those would be a little boost right there to get the roots going. Here's the liquid fertilizer being made. Horse poop in a bucket, very cheap. Dilute it till it's about the color of this siding here. I think we've done it. I think that's it for fertilizer. what about other questions? Are you getting other questions? Or?
Oh yeah, we've got lots of questions. I was just going to ask how much weight you put in with companion planting and the idea that like beans put nitrogen into the system, sort of create their own nitrogen, and do they then transfer that to the other plants growing around them, or is that kind of not enough to make that big of a difference?
Oh, it certainly helps, but not in the year that the beans are growing. Legumes, which is your beans and your peas and broad beans, they have bacteria that make a little, they're like little nitrogen factories in the roots. The bacteria colonize the roots of those plants. And the bacteria take nitrogen from the air, which the plants cannot use, and change it into another form of nitrogen the plants can use. So the peas and beans, while they're growing, they're making their own nitrogen. And one of the ways you can tell a garden is deficient in nitrogen is the legumes are growing really well and the other crops aren't. And because legumes make their own nitrogen. Next year, or after you've cut those bean plants off and pea plants and their plants are dead, the little nitrogen factories break open, they're little nodules on the roots, that nitrogen becomes available to the next crop. So in agriculture, it's a very valuable practice. You grow legumes one year in a field, and then you grow something that's a heavy feeding that needs the nitrogen the next year. In a garden, practically speaking, it's very much depends on how many beans and peas and things that you grow, whether you would have enough to move them all around the garden to enrich the soil. But planting beans, where the beans growing this year don't feed that nitrogen to the other plants. I know a lot of people talk about the three sisters planting, the corn, beans, and squash. Well, the beans are going to be providing nitrogen to next year's crops for sure, but they don't provide very much at all to this year's crop. So yes, it's where the legumes have been growing, there'll be nitrogen, but it isn't enough usually for a really practical garden. It's helpful. So move your beans and peas around, and that definitely benefits the soil.
Okay, that's great. That's really helpful information. And I'm just trying to sort of skim through people's questions and see if we can sort of put them in some sort of order. But somebody has been asking about their blueberries, saying that they've tested their pH and they've had rich lasagna soil, and they've had them in 3 different locations, but they're not thriving. And they're wondering if you might have some insight into why.
Did the person say what the pH was in the test?
No, I'm looking back to see if they...
Blueberries need really acid soil that has had no amendments at all that would have an alkalizing or raising or an alkaline effect. No wood ashes, no bone meal whatsoever, no lime. And some soils, there are soils on the coast that are not acidic. It's most common for soils to be quite acidic, but blueberries like a pH of 5.1, which is really acid. Blueberries need a lot of, I guess they need a lot of iron, but, and that's what's available at low pH. I have, in other gardens, had no luck at all with blueberries growing in soil that had been an old garden that someone else had, because there was a residual effect of the lime and even just a lot of manure. Manure will raise a pH too. And we don't want that for blueberries. So it's probably that they're not doing well because the soil is not acidic enough. You can get sulfur from the garden centers and mix that in to make your soil more acidic. But if you've got a soil test, that is going to be helpful because you will know whether, in fact, this is the pH you're aiming at is 5.1 to 5.3. The other question, I suppose, is are the plants not doing well, or they're just not getting flowers that are setting fruit? That's 2 separate issues.
Okay.
They grow very well, but they're not getting pollinated because there's not enough pollinators around. And that's 2 different things. So.
Okay, well, hopefully that's been helpful. If she puts a bit more information, we can try to go back to it. We do have people wondering, and I think this is true for some people, you know, you get your seed packets or your starts and they all say that they want 6 hours at least of full sun, and maybe some of your garden has full sun, but not enough for all of the things you want to grow. are there some suggestions that of what you can do to mitigate things if you just don't necessarily, you have more of a shady garden than a sunny garden?
If you truly have a shady garden, you just can't grow vegetables. I'm sorry, but there are, if you've got 4 hours of sun somewhere, then lettuce and spinach and a lot of the salad greens will do fine. They just grow a little slower, but they will be a good quality. What can't handle shade at all is things where you need the fruit to flowers and fruit, like tomatoes and beans and corn and squash and things like that. They have to have that long day. Now, most gardens at this time of year, because the sun is very high in the sky, most people can get 6 hours of direct sun as long as it's not under a tree somewhere. If you're actually out in a yard somewhere, the buildings and with the sun shining straight down on the garden, you might have more sun than you think. But you can just save your sunny spots for the tomatoes and squash and things like beans, and put the leafy greens in the shade. For sure, that can work. You'll need to give them a little longer time to mature, but they will manage.
Okay, that's good. There's some hope for people then with shady gardens.
Yeah.
Somebody's asking about, Kyla wants to know about if you can talk about the uses for seaweed. And I'm also curious if it's still something we should be doing, taking seaweed from the beaches. But I know it's definitely good for our garden, but I wondered if you could speak to the uses for it. And
right, the seaweed is compost of the sea, and the marine system needs the seaweed. So if you were going to take it off a beach, you're robbing an ecosystem of its compost. That's not waste. That is nutrients in the sea. And I didn't realize how valuable it was. Years ago, I worked on a state of environment report for British Columbia on the marine ecosystem. And I dealt with all these marine scientists. And I was like, I had no idea that was not waste. And it's actually not legal to take seaweed off the beaches in some of the municipalities like Victoria and possibly Vancouver. The problem is that there's not very much seaweed and there's a lot of people. And in some areas of the country, when I farmed in Prince Edward Island, we always took seaweed off the beach. Very few people, a huge amount of seaweed. It was a common fertilizer. It is, of course, excellent for the soil, but it is very low in nitrogen, by the way. It's not like manure or fish compost. It's good nutrient value. So it has a value there, and you'll see in a lot of the complete organic fertilizer, kelp meal will be an important ingredient to provide various nutrients. So yes, it's excellent for the soil, but it's really poor for the marine ecosystem to take away the seaweed from the beach.
And so if you were going to tell somebody to use an alternative, if they've been using seaweed to date, and maybe they won't be using it anymore, is there something that you would suggest as an alternative to that?
Well, I would just go back to using compost, because seaweed doesn't provide organic matter or nitrogen. It's providing micronutrients, but you don't really have a micronutrient problem if you're using leaves, and compost is made of so many ingredients that it will have the micronutrients that are necessary. So anything that you could get, any kind of compost and fish compost, your own compost, all of that will work fine.
Okay, great. That's really good information and good to know, because I know a lot of us on the coast kind of go to the beach and do a bit of a...
Well, when there's a lot of seaweed and very few people, there's no harm done. But when it's the other way around, then you can see that it does strip the marine ecosystem of necessary food.
Okay. I like this next question because I think a lot of us here on the coast deal with deer in our garden, and Sparrow is asking if you can collect deer droppings to soak in water for nitrogen amendment. So
yeah, absolutely. Deer drop, anything like that. The safe fertilizers, meaning no risk, not a serious risk of human disease, are rabbit, deer, goat, llama. I've seen people selling llama manure, sheep manure, and horse manure. The problematical manures are cattle and poultry and pig manure that have come from farming operations. If it's your backyard chickens, absolutely use that. So yeah, You're diluting it with a lot of water. So even if it's a very high nitrogen manure like chicken manure, it's going to be diluted anyway. So there's not really a risk to the plants.
Okay, great.
Yeah, when you find where the deer have been sleeping at night, you can find quite a few little deer pellets and get quite a bucket full that way.
Yeah, and it's probably really good because they've just eaten your garden, so it's nice and healthy. So lots of questions about different things people can use to amend their soil, and somebody's asking about the use of coffee grounds in the garden.
You can certainly use coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are about 2% nitrogen. There are some other compounds in there, obviously, as we know, as we drink it. So the warning is to don't use a whole lot of it at once in any one place. You can mix it directly in the soil and you can put it in compost. So yes, absolutely use the coffee grounds, but don't use a huge amount at one time. You know, just dilute it and mix it in.
Okay, great. So we have Keely, who was asking about her blueberries and how come they weren't thriving. And she says the pH was about 5.5.
That's a little high, but they should have been okay. But it is a little high, so she might want to put some sulfur, aluminum sulfate. You buy that at the garden centers will have that for this purpose, to acidify the soil for blueberries, because it's a common problem.
Okay. And she says the stems are brown and the tips of the branches look burnt. So some of the crops had been good, but last year some had flowers, but not many blueberries. And they've had lots of manure in there, so she'll stop that, she says. Yeah,
manure does raise the pH. The other thing she could do is, you can go online and look at the BC Ministry of Agriculture has all the crop production guides online, and look up blueberry diseases and see if any of the pictures, that sounds like it could be a disease problem, and it is possible for sure that there was a disease and it has nothing to do with the pH problem. But she'll need to, send a picture, find a picture, and the place I always look first is BC Ministry of Agriculture at their photos. So you'll have to burrow down into their website a little bit, but they do have that information available. Or Google blueberry diseases, but always when you're doing that, always put British Columbia into your search string, because otherwise you might find out what's going on in Australia or England, and it wouldn't necessarily be the same as here.
Okay, great, well, thank you. And then we have a couple questions about people's fruit trees right now. So both Candace, it's from the same person, different trees. Both her nectarine and apricot trees are producing leaves and flowers in the spring, but the leaves have fallen off and the trunk is now seeping sap. Can she save her tree?
If the trunk is seeping sap, well, the sap, the golden gooey sap is coming from a disease. It's a canker disease. It's a bacterial canker that is very common in nectarines, peaches, cherries, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, it is a death sentence for the tree if the canker is on the main trunk. If it's on a branch, you can prune that out. You might have to chase it around the tree and prune it out of 3 or 4 or 5 branches, like prune about 6 inches below where the weepy soft spot is, where the yellow sticky sap is coming out. That's the canker. If it's on the main trunk, everything above that will die. So if it's way up the trunk, and it's a very young tree, you could cut below that and see if the buds will break. I once saved a peach tree that did that, but it was only about a 3-year-old tree. If it's a more mature tree, it's just a matter of time, and it will unfortunately not make it, and that's very common.
Okay, thank you. Well, after the deer question, we've had a few other people wondering about other kinds of animal manure. I don't know,
Gosh,
one was about dog.
Oh, absolutely not using dog, no dog, no cat manure in your garden. Now, cats spread a disease called toxoplasmosis, which is really very dangerous. And so don't ever let kitties use your beds as kitty litter boxes.
They seem to like to, too.
They do, because the soil is very loose and it's dry and just right. So get chicken wire laid over it, or use there's a device that was actually invented to scare kitties out of beds, of garden beds. It's called the Scarecrow. That actually will scare any animal out. It shoots water at them. Has a motion detector. Any garden center will sell it. You hook it up to a hose. It has a little spike on the bottom. You stand it in the bed, and the motion detector is the same as a switch that would turn on a light, say at your garage outdoor as a motion light. But instead of turning on a light, this has a sprinkler head on it that is the kind that shoots water. It goes, psh, 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 a very sharp sound. And that will train a cat in one night. I have done that to neighbors' cats, and it doesn't hurt them. It's like somebody being up all night with a squirt gun. But it also keeps raccoons out of fruit and things like that. But and it's more built for that. But it was originally invented to keep cats out of beds. And so absolutely cover that bed, screen that bed. When the bed is completely full of plants, they aren't going to use it as a kitty litter box. But
Right.
it's very dangerous to have cat manure in your garden vegetables. And dog manure is not desirable. Dogs can have tapeworms. And so flipping the dog manure into the rhododendron bushes is probably a better idea.
Great. And the same with any, like if you were to use chicken manure, somebody mentioned bunny manure, is it just important for those ones, particularly chicken manure, which I think can be a bit strong? Do you need to age them, or
well, we were talking about it as for one of these liquid fertilizers. You don't age it. If you're going to put it in a bucket of water, you don't have to age it. And rabbit manure, llama, sheep, goat, deer can be put straight into the garden if it doesn't have a lot of bedding mixed in with it. It's the bedding that is very high in carbon and it needs to break down. So if you've got a source of rabbit manure and the rabbits have been in the kind of cages where the manure is falling through the wire, it's just pure manure. You can put that straight into the garden. Chicken manure, though, should be composted first unless you're using it in a bucket of water like this.
Okay, so that's one way to get around that. It would be to be diluting it in water.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a good one. This is for people that are maybe doing their gardening in containers, and they're wondering about improving the drainage in their container gardens.
Well, the thing is mainly the soil itself. Just make sure the holes in the pots are not clogged. And then the soil itself should have some kind of component that prevents the soil from compacting. So that might be vermiculite or perlite, could be sand. If the containers are on a roof or a balcony, then you want very lightweight material like vermiculite or perlite. If it's a container sitting on a patio, you could use sand. So there's a fair component of that in there. And any mix that you will see listed for containers will have a generous part, a quarter or a third of the mix will be this kind of material to provide drainage and aeration. So make sure the holes in the pot are not clogged. And then you might also want to put the pot up on little pot feet, or 3 pebbles or fancy little pottery pot feet. Any of those things work to make sure that it drains and it isn't sitting sealed down on a surface so that it, with roots getting into the hole, that can actually cause that hole to be plugged up with, the soil may be fine, but the water can't get out of the pot.
So for a few of the tomato plants I put in containers this year, I did put a little bit of gravel at the bottom before I added the soil. Is that still okay?
You don't really need to. It doesn't hurt anything, but it doesn't really do anything apparently. It's just with the way water drains through material. If any of you know the website of Linda Chalker-Scott, she's a Washington State University researcher and has a really interesting website. And it's just spelled like chalker, like somebody writing chalk on a chalkboard. Scott, Linda Chalker-Scott. And you will see papers that she has researched, lots of things that are like garden myths or just things that we all did for about 30 or 40 years and nobody asked any questions as to whether they were really necessary or not. And that would be one, like putting gravel in the bottom of the pot. It won't hurt, but it doesn't really help either. But what you do want to make sure is that the holes are not clogged up.
Okay, great. Okay, this next question is close to my heart, coming from Tracy, and it's a different kind of pest, and it's any tips for managing bindweed or morning glory? And I would add to that buttercup.
Oh, I've just spent the whole spring digging buttercup out of my little scrap of flower beds and lawns. Okay, well, let's take the bindweed and morning glory first. These plants don't thrive in really dry conditions. So they will come into, they'll come in on the wet side of a yard from maybe another yard or a waste area or something. So if you can make that a dry area, where I used to live years ago, I had morning glory coming from the neighbors because they liked it on the fence. And I finally gave up having perennial beds on that side of the yard and just put in annual beds, and then with drip irrigation and or linear irrigation systems, you don't have to water the pathways. The morning glory will be a lot less likely to cross dry areas that are never watered. And then when you pull it out of beds that you're going to use annually, you just have to remove it once, and yeah, it'll grow back a little bit, but for that year, the season, the garden will be fine. It doesn't work to let it go though if you've got perennial material there, whether it's flowers or perennial vegetables. It just doesn't work. The other thing is it turns out that morning glory is actually very susceptible to heat. If you have a flamer, if anybody has a sidewalk flamer for de-icing your sidewalk, or there are flamers actually made for this purpose for weeding, if you flame it very quickly, not quickly enough, not long enough to actually fry the leaves, but just flame it very, very quickly, heating it, it will, the plant will basically kill itself trying to recover from the injury of being heated, which is a little complicated a way of saying it, but you can play around with it with boiling water even. It's pretty susceptible to that. You'd have to keep doing it. The best thing with morning glory is to decide where your boundary is going to be. Dig down, put in a barrier, put in some galvanized metal or roof, let's see, what am I thinking, flashing for roofs, or you can actually buy snap together recycled plastic panels that are called, that are root barrier. I think brand name is actually one of them is root barrier. Home hardwares tend to have them. So make yourself, draw a line, and this is the barrier. Put in your root barrier, and then the roots will not be coming in anymore from that side, and then spend your time just deleting or removing the morning glory on your side of the barrier, either by pulling it out manually, keeping it dry, making sure no water gets there for irrigation, all of these things. And eventually, if you can get ahead of it, it won't be coming back in from the other side of the barrier. Now, buttercup is another one that thrives in very wet conditions, but once it gets started, it seems to be able to go into almost any condition. The runners spread. And there's really no remedy for that one except to get out your weed fork and your gloves and settle down and put in 20 minutes a day forever until it's out of your lawn or wherever it is. It isn't easy to kill. I mean, even if you try to use herbicides on it, it doesn't work very well. So there's not really an easy solution to buttercup except to keep at it.
Yes, that's been my mantra this year with it, and it's definitely been a challenge. And then I find that in digging it up, I'm then sort of exposing other weed seeds that are now sort of
come up. Yes, that's called the seed bank. It's just waiting for you to disturb the soil so those seeds can come up.
Yeah, exactly. So the weeds are growing faster than like my beets and carrots can make it, can't quite compete with seeds coming up.
Well, those seeds, if it's in your vegetable garden, dig the buttercup out and then use mulches to control the rest of those, because those little seeds are coming up and they're going to die if they're under a mulch. Buttercup will not die under a mulch. It'll thrive with the mulch. Thank you very much. But so you're going to have to root that out. But anything else that's germinating is quite readily killed early on by mulching. So you might get your mulches on sooner rather than.
But can you mulch over the seeds? So if I planted my beets, like the seeds.
Not the beet seed, no.
Yeah, so that's what's happening. Those new little weeds are kind of coming up before the bees can make it out. But
well, you have to get those little fellas above ground first. Now,
yeah,
if you have a huge amount of seed germinating, it might be worth it before you sow another bed, doing this staged seed germination and removal method. And what you do is empty the bed, like take out all the weeds and have it all ready to plant, and then you cultivate for 4 inches deep. Disturb that all, give it a week or two for those seeds to germinate. You cultivate 2 inches deep, and you disturb it and give it another week or two for those seeds to germinate. And then you cultivate just shallowly on the surface and plant your seeds. Now that you're seeding, but what you've done is depleted the immediate seed bank at the surface, and then a little lower and a little lower. And you've really depleted that root zone of seeds. So it's a way that professional lawn care people sometimes build a lawn this way, to get the weed seeds out, the seed bank, deplete that seed bank before they put the lawn in, so that the lawn doesn't have a big catch of seeds coming in. So it takes a little while.
Well, that's a great idea.
And then mulch the minute you possibly know where your seedlings are, mulch around and start getting mulches on there.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. We've had Lana asking about her bok choy and that the stems are turning purple. And what can she do about that?
I wonder what the leaves look like.
In
and of itself, purple coloration might have something to do with the variety. I mean, that in and of itself wouldn't give me wouldn't worry me if the leaves were looking like they should. If the whole plant is turning purpley, or the lower leaves are purple and sometimes they're turning purple and then brown, that's general nutrient deficiency. That's more than just nitrogen. That means get a complete organic fertilizer in there for your next crop, because probably this one will go to seed prematurely if it's that deficient. So I guess it depends where the purple is, whether this is eat the crop up and start over with more compost and more fertilizer, or whether it's that might just be a normal color.
Okay. Well, it seems like lots of people are dealing with different pests still, and one of the main ones seems to be wireworm. They still and one person, Kim, is asking, how does she get rid of wireworms, and will they continue to do the damage all summer? They're killing romaine. She's using potato baits, but she's wondering if there's anything else that she can do.
Oh, somebody finally wants to see my wireworm slides.
Waiting for it.
Wireworms are a much vexed creature. This is one species here, this beetle. This is what the beetle, there's another one that's kind of black and one that's kind of more orangish. There are several different species here. I like this slide, this picture, because it shows you a comparison to a dime. This is the size we think of wireworms, but they actually can, when they hatch from eggs and start growing, they're really teeny. When they're this teeny, we don't notice them and they don't really do that much damage. But the larvae are the damaging things, and you see this is the holes they make in potatoes and carrots and dahlia tubers and all kinds of things, and they really like to bore into corn and lettuce seedlings. So one thing that is a real problem with a new garden, if it was sod last year or in the last couple years, it probably has a lot of wireworms in it. These beetles come to the lawn or a grassy or a weedy garden. It doesn't, if as long as it's grassy and weedy, the beetles are laying eggs. They were out last month laying eggs. And in the first year, the eggs are, little larvae are so small you don't notice, but it takes 4 years for them to develop to full size. 3 or 4 years, even 5. So you have to assume that there were quite a lot in the lawn as you start, and you're going to have to wait till they leave. It's going to take 4 years for them to get out. So you can plant late. That helps because the wireworms go deeper in the soil in the summer. And then there are some crops they're not really a problem with. It's the potatoes and carrots and onions and things, the roots that really get clobbered. So you can plant other things. As you're cultivating the soil or just disturbing it or transplanting it, you'll notice the wireworms are very easy to see. So just always be on alert and pull them out and destroy them when you see them. And then the other thing you can do is trap them. And I'll show you a trap in a minute. But I just want to show you corn seedlings. Man, this is like candy for wireworms. This is quite grisly. And they even climbed up the center of this corn here. This is a trap, and I use these every year. This is a chunk of potato on a stick. You can use any kind of stick or skewer, any kind of potato. Just put a chunk of it on there and bury it in the bed where you're going to be planting a crop that's really going to be damaged by wireworms. That would be the priority where to put it. I actually have a little strip of grass along one side of my garden, my vegetable garden, and the wireworms come from the grass into my garden. So I run this little security line of potato chunks along just that bed on that side near the lawn, where the lawn is, every year to clear out the wireworms. The CO2 from the potato attracts them, and they come in here and they love potatoes. They burrowed all through it. So just in 2 days, they will come to that potato, and you can pull up the potato and pull the wireworms out. And people that know me know that I'm really cheap. I reuse that potato till it's practically mush, but you can just keep replacing it and pulling the wireworms out. That is a way of trapping them out of an area. And if I had a bed where I thought there was a lot of wireworms, I'd probably put a little potato chunk every 2 or 3 square feet, and do that before you plant anything else. And do that as long as you can before you have to plant, and just keep pulling out the wireworms. Now, these are all of a size that they'll become beetles this year if I hadn't killed them. And so I didn't see any really tiny wireworms, so I think maybe I'm cleared them out of those beds, but it will take some time, unfortunately. Now, I just have one last slide here as a warning. There are these golden larvae that look exactly like wireworms, but they're not golden, they're pale, they're cream colored. And this is a predator of wireworms. Here's a wireworm here with a hole in it. And these stiletto fly larvae, whenever I show this slide in workshops, people say, oh, I've seen that. That is not a pale wireworm, that is a good guy. So really be aware that you're looking at this kind of thing coming to your potato. You would never see these stiletto flies in there, but you would see them in the soil. That's about it. It's patience, trapping. There has been research on some light traps and things like that. It doesn't seem to have gone anywhere yet. And some of the things that commercial growers use, they're not feasible for us. So basically keeping on pulling them out. And then something I didn't actually really go into was on this slide. Don't use fall rye or cover crops in a vegetable garden. The fall rye is there over the winter and it's there in the spring, and that is just classic for attracting these beetles to lay eggs. So keep the weeds out of your garden and just have your crop plants and lots of leaf mulch, and you won't have you'll have a minimum amount of beetles coming back to your garden to lay eggs. So once you get the majority of wireworms out, then they won't be that damaging. There'll be very few.
We've had Julie ask, she's heard that her raised beds that have grass around them might be part of her wireworm issue. Would that add to it?
Yeah, I have the problem. Now, the way raised beds have board sides or stone sides or something, it's less of an issue. But yes, I have raised beds without sides. And on the lawn side, I always have wireworms. So every year I do this. So if she could convert the garden area, those pathways around her beds could be, you could lay down newspaper and put wood chips on top or leaves or something, and that would really change that habitat to be very unfriendly for wireworms. So you could change that. That's what the rest of my garden is like that, and I don't worry about wireworms except along that lawn line. But the puppy has to have somewhere to play, so.
That's right. Puppies are important.
Puppies are important.
Well, thank you, Linda. I think that's all the time we have for questions. I would suggest for people who are still looking for answers to some of their pest questions, Linda, if you go to Linda's website, she does have the book West Coast Gardening natural insect, weed, and disease control. So that can help you out with some of your issues with pests and whatnot. Linda also has her book, Resilient Gardeners, Pollinators, Gardens, Garlic Diseases, and Pest Update. And this is an updated edition, and that's available at Linda's site as well. And then, of course, her beautiful book, Backyard Bounty, The Complete Guide to Year-Round Organic Gardening in the Pacific Northwest. This is 20% off on our website, on the New Society website right now when you use the code BOUNTY. So that's on the New Society publishers, newsociety.com or .ca. I've had a few people who live on Gabriola asking if they can go to the office to pick up a copy. The best thing to do is to email info@newsociety.com to find out, because we just don't have the staff in the office the same way we normally do under normal circumstances. So if we do have copies in the office and you email the office, they can arrange to get you a copy that way. But again, ordering from our site and you receive a discount, or go to Linda's site for some of her other books as well. If people would like to do something like this again, and Linda's willing, let us know, because we like to know what you're interested in. And we know that this time people are all looking for as many resources as they can. And Linda's a wonderful resource for helping us all, so we're not all making the same mistakes, and we're learning from one another. And I definitely recommend for both new and experienced gardeners to pick up Linda's book. It's just a wealth of information about gardening on the West Coast, and it's just really like having Linda beside you in the garden. It's lovely. So I just really want to thank you, Linda, and we just really appreciate the time you spent with us today. And thanks so much to everybody who tuned in with us today. And I am sorry about how the event was set up. If there were issues finding it, I will do better next time and making sure that it's an easier.
Let's do this another time.
Practice, 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 just like gardening. So thank you so much, everybody. And yeah, enjoy your evening and enjoy your garden.
Thanks.